What you're about to see is the day Britain invaded Palestine, a moment that would change the Middle East forever. Centuries of Palestinian life, culture, and governance were about to be disrupted as foreign soldiers marched onto the land under the Union Jack, promising freedom while planting the seeds of occupation. Palestine before the invasion. For centuries, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, a land with thriving cities, towns, and villages. Jerusalem, Hebron, Jaffa, and Gaza were centers of trade, faith, and culture. Generations of Palestinians lived on this land, farming, trading, praying, and maintaining a rich cultural heritage that had endured for centuries. By the early 20th century, however, the Ottoman Empire was weakening, unable to maintain control over its distant territories. Across the Middle East, European powers, especially Britain and France, were eyeing the region as an opportunity for expansion. World War I had shaken the globe, and as the Ottoman Empire sided with the Central Powers, the fate of Palestine became a strategic concern for the Allies. Its ports, fertile lands, and historic significance made it a prize. But the people living there had little say in the decisions being made, far away in European capitals. Palestinians were accustomed to centuries of local governance with their own traditions, communities, and legal systems. Life was disrupted by new alliances, wartime pressures, and foreign ambitions, yet the land remained theirs. Until the day Britain arrived. Britain moves in. In 1917, British troops advanced into Palestine, entering towns and cities with military precision. Their march into Jerusalem was both a symbolic and strategic moment. Soldiers raised the Union Jack over the city walls, signaling that Palestine was now under foreign control. To the world, Britain presented itself as a liberator. Newspapers and propaganda emphasized order, modernization, and the promise of peace. But for the Palestinian people, the reality was different. These foreign troops were not protecting the land. They were asserting control, imposing a new authority, and setting the stage for colonization. The streets of Jerusalem, once filled with merchants, families, and religious pilgrims, now saw soldiers marching in formation. The rhythm of daily life was interrupted as the city adjusted to the sudden presence of an outside power. Local leaders had little choice but to accept the occupation, while ordinary citizens watched, uncertain of what the future would hold. Britain's invasion was not just a military maneuver, it was a political statement. By planting the Union Jack on Palestinian soil, Britain was signaling its dominance, reshaping the power structure, and laying the foundation for decades of foreign control. Palestinians, whose ancestors had lived on this land for generations, were now under the rule of a distant empire that prioritized its own interests over their lives, rights, and heritage. The Balfour Declaration, betrayal in print. In 1917, the same year British troops marched into Palestine, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, a brief letter that promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. On the surface, it appeared as a gesture of support for Jewish aspirations after centuries of persecution in Europe. Yet beneath the formal language lay a profound betrayal of the Palestinian people. At the same time, Britain had made conflicting promises to the Arab leadership through the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, assuring independence for Arab lands, including Palestine, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. This dual promise revealed Britain's true priorities: imperial gain over fairness or justice. Palestinians who had lived on the land for centuries suddenly found themselves ignored in negotiations about their own homeland. Their rights, voices, and history were sidelined, while foreign powers made decisions about their future. The Balfour Declaration was more than just a diplomatic letter. It was a turning point. It symbolized Britain's strategy of divide and rule, favoring settler interests while dismissing the existing population. Palestinians began to realize that their homeland was not being protected, but rather being handed over to foreign ambitions. Visually, one can imagine the document itself. Crisp, official, and seemingly benign, yet it carried consequences far beyond the ink on paper. For Palestinians, it was a declaration of dispossession and betrayal, the beginning of a process that would accelerate under British rule. The Balfour Declaration set the stage for decades of tension and conflict, undermining centuries of Palestinian life and planting the seeds of resentment that would continue for generations. It was the moment when promises of freedom and protection turned into a roadmap for colonization. British Mandate officially begins. By 1920, the League of Nations officially granted Britain the mandate over Palestine, formalizing what had already begun with the invasion. This marked a significant shift. Britain was no longer just an occupying force. It had become the official colonial authority, tasked with governing the land, its people, and its resources. Under the mandate, Britain controlled key aspects of Palestinian life. Immigration. Britain opened the door to waves of Jewish settlers, allowing migration while severely limiting Palestinian political representation. Land sales. Policies favored foreign settlers, and land transactions often resulted in the displacement of Palestinian farmers and families. Administration. Governance, law, and public services were now administered by British authorities, reducing Palestinian influence over their own country. For Palestinians, this period marked a deepening sense of dispossession. The land they had cultivated and lived on for generations was increasingly controlled by outsiders, and their ability to shape their future was systematically constrained. The mandate was a formal recognition of British authority, but for the people on the ground, it was the continuation of occupation under a bureaucratic guise. The symbolism of the mandate was also stark. British officials now carried the power to decide who could settle, where communities could live, and how the land could be used. The Palestinian population, despite being the majority, found their voices increasingly ignored. This era laid the foundation for long-term tension. It was no longer a temporary occupation or a military presence. Britain had become the architect of policy, immigration, and administration, embedding colonial control into the very structure of Palestinian society. The mandate was a clear declaration. Palestinians were no longer in charge of their own homeland, and foreign interests were now determining their fate. The consequences. Dispossession begins with Britain firmly in control under the mandate. The stage was set for decades of conflict and dispossession. British policies encouraged waves of Jewish immigration, dramatically altering the demographics of Palestine. Communities that had lived on the land for centuries suddenly saw settlers arriving with the support of the colonial power, reshaping towns, villages, and farmland. Palestinian families felt betrayed. Their land, livelihoods, and heritage were being systematically affected by policies over which they had no control. Farmers were displaced, property was sold or confiscated, and centuries-old communities faced uncertainty. What had been a homeland for generations was increasingly administered by outsiders who prioritized imperial and settler interests over the rights of the indigenous population. This was not just a political change, it was a human crisis. Ordinary Palestinians experienced fear, frustration, and helplessness as their future was dictated by distant authorities. Britain's actions under the mandate did not protect Palestine. They facilitated its gradual takeover, sowing the seeds of a conflict that would erupt violently decades later. The consequences of Britain's invasion and policies were profound. Families lost land and resources, facing growing insecurity. Palestinians were denied meaningful representation, while settlers received preferential treatment. These policies laid the groundwork for the Nakba in 1948, when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forced from their homes. The day Britain invaded Palestine marked the beginning of a new era, one where foreign occupation, broken promises, and systematic dispossession became central to Palestinian life. It was a turning point that reshaped the region, setting the stage for decades of struggle, resilience, and resistance. This was the day Britain invaded Palestine, the start of a century of occupation, broken promises, and dispossession. Follow Days Gone By to uncover more forgotten moments, witness history as it unfolded, and see the stories of Palestine and its people.